Welcome to Midnight and Murder Crime Stories. Perfect for late hours, heavy eyelids, and the space between wake and sleep. Dim the lights, let the quiet take hold, and let the stories carry you. Let's go. Story 1, The Florist's Secret Garden. Detective Elena Rodriguez arrived at Rosewood Florist on a drizzly Thursday morning to investigate what had initially appeared to be a simple case of vandalism. The shop's owner, Mrs. Catherine Rosewood, had discovered that someone had been systematically stealing rare orchid varieties from her greenhouse. But the thefts had been so carefully executed that she had only noticed when preparing for the annual Orchid Society exhibition. The missing orchids were not ordinary flowers. They were prize-winning specimens that Mrs. Rosewood had been cultivating for over a decade. Each plant was worth thousands of dollars and represented years of careful breeding and nurturing. The thief had taken only the most valuable varieties, leaving behind the more common orchids and showing clear expertise in identifying the most precious specimens. Rodriguez began by examining the greenhouse, a climate-controlled structure behind the main flower shop. The security was minimal, just a simple lock on the door and no cameras. Mrs. Rosewood explained that she had never worried about theft before, as orchid cultivation was such a specialized field that few people would know how to properly care for stolen plants. The investigation revealed that the thefts had been occurring over several months, with one or two plants disappearing each time. The thief had been remarkably careful, taking plants in a way that made their absence less noticeable. Empty spots had been cleverly concealed by rearranging the remaining orchids, and the thief had even left behind small notes about the care requirements for the remaining plants. Rodriguez interviewed Mrs. Rosewood's employees and regular customers. The flower shop employed 3 people: Janet Mills, who had worked there for 8 years and handled most of the daily operations; Thomas Chen, a part-time employee who helped with deliveries and basic maintenance; and Dr. Patricia Vance, a retired botanist who volunteered to help with the more complex orchid care. Dr. Vance was particularly interesting to Rodriguez. She had extensive knowledge of orchid cultivation and had been helping Mrs. Rosewood develop new hybrid varieties. She had access to the greenhouse and knew the value of each plant. However, she seemed genuinely concerned about the thefts and had been helping Mrs. Rosewood improve her security measures. The case took an unexpected turn when Rodriguez discovered that someone had been selling rare orchids through online auction sites. The seller, using the handle Orchid Expert 47, had been offering plants that matched the descriptions of Mrs. Rosewood's stolen specimens. The auctions had been carefully timed to coincide with major orchid shows in other cities, where buyers would be less likely to ask questions about the plant's origins. Rodriguez traced the online sales to a P.O. box registered under a false name, but the address led to a mail forwarding service that protected the seller's identity. The breakthrough came when she noticed that the seller's auction listings contained detailed information about each plant's breeding history, information that would only be known to someone intimately familiar with Mrs. Rosewood's cultivation records. The investigation revealed that Janet Mills had been facing serious financial difficulties. Her husband had been laid off from his job 6 months earlier, and they were struggling to keep up with mortgage payments and medical bills for their diabetic daughter. Janet had been working extra hours at the flower shop, but her salary wasn't enough to cover their mounting expenses. Rodriguez discovered that Janet had been using her knowledge of the greenhouse to identify the most valuable plants and had been researching their market value through orchid collector forums. She had initially planned to take just 1 or 2 plants to sell, but the high prices they commanded had tempted her to continue the thefts over several months. The case deepened when Rodriguez learned that Janet had been creating detailed care instructions for each stolen plant, ensuring that the buyers would be able to keep them alive. She had genuinely loved the orchids and had been troubled by the thought that her thefts might result in the plant's death. Her careful documentation had actually helped the buyers maintain the stolen specimens successfully. Rodriguez also discovered that Janet had been planning to eventually return some of the orchids to Mrs. Rosewood's greenhouse. She had been propagating several of the stolen plants, hoping to create offspring that she could secretly return while keeping the parent plants for sale. This complex plan showed both her deep knowledge of orchid cultivation and her conflicted feelings about the thefts. The investigation revealed that Janet had been accessing the greenhouse after hours using her legitimate key. She had been careful to visit only when Mrs. Rosewood was away and had timed her thefts to coincide with periods when the missing plants would be less likely to be noticed. She had even been maintaining detailed records of her thefts, planning to eventually confess and make restitution. When confronted with the evidence, Janet broke down and confessed to the thefts. She explained that she had never intended to become a criminal, but the combination of financial desperation and the valuable plants had created an irresistible temptation. She had been telling herself that she would eventually return the orchids or pay for them, but she had gotten caught up in the cycle of theft and sale. The case was resolved with a mixture of justice and compassion. Mrs. Rosewood was shocked by Janet's betrayal, but recognized the desperate circumstances that had driven her trusted employee to steal. Rather than pressing for the maximum penalties, she worked with the prosecutor to arrange a plea deal that included restitution and community service. Several of the stolen orchids were recovered from buyers who agreed to return them when they learned about the thefts. Janet used her detailed records to help track down the missing plants, and she provided expert testimony about their care requirements to ensure their survival. The case became a cautionary tale about how financial pressure can drive good people to make poor choices, while also highlighting the importance of trust and communication in small businesses. Mrs. Rosewood eventually hired Janet back on a part-time basis after she completed her community service, recognizing that her knowledge and genuine care for the plants made her too valuable to lose permanently. The greenhouse was equipped with better security measures, but more importantly, Mrs. Rosewood established a fund to help employees facing financial difficulties, hoping to prevent similar situations in the future. Story 2, The Watchmaker's Precision. Detective Marcus Thompson was called to investigate a peculiar case at Timepiece Treasures, the city's oldest watch repair shop. The owner, master watchmaker Giuseppe Torino, had discovered that several valuable vintage watches had been stolen from his workshop, but the thefts had been so precisely executed that he had only noticed when customers came to collect their repaired timepieces. The stolen watches were all rare vintage models that had been brought in for restoration. A 1940s Patek Philippe, a 1950s Rolex Submariner, and a 1960s Omega Speedmaster. Each watch was worth tens of thousands of dollars and represented the pinnacle of horological craftsmanship. The thief had replaced each stolen watch with a carefully crafted replica that looked identical to casual observation. Thompson began by examining the workshop, a cramped space filled with specialized tools and workbenches that had been Giuseppe's domain for over 30 years. The security was minimal, just a basic alarm system and a single camera that monitored the customer area but not the workshop itself. Giuseppe explained that he had never worried about theft because watchmaking was such a specialized skill that few people would know how to properly handle valuable timepieces. The investigation revealed that the thefts had been occurring over the past 6 months, with one watch disappearing every few weeks. The thief had been remarkably skilled, creating replicas that duplicated not just the appearance of the original watches, but also their weight and basic mechanical functions. The forgeries were so convincing that customers had initially accepted them without question. Thompson interviewed Giuseppe's small staff and regular customers. The workshop employed 2 people besides Giuseppe: Maria Santos, a young apprentice who was learning the trade, and Robert Hayes, an experienced watchmaker who had been working there for 5 years. There was also Dr. Patricia Vance, a retired engineer who had become fascinated with mechanical watches and often visited the shop to observe the restoration process. Robert Hayes immediately drew Thompson's attention. He had the skills necessary to create convincing replicas and had intimate knowledge of the workshop's inventory. He had access to the necessary tools and materials, and he would have known exactly when each customer was scheduled to collect their watch. However, he seemed genuinely distressed about the thefts and had been helping Giuseppe implement better security measures. The case took an interesting turn when Thompson discovered that someone had been selling vintage watches through high-end auction houses in other cities. The seller had been using different names and addresses, but the watches matched the descriptions of the stolen timepieces. The auctions had been carefully scheduled to occur after sufficient time had passed for the thefts to be discovered. Thompson traced the auction sales and found that the seller had been using sophisticated knowledge of watch collecting to maximize the sale prices. The watches had been sold with detailed provenance documentation and certificates of authenticity that appeared to be genuine. This level of expertise suggested that the thief was deeply embedded in the watch collecting community. The investigation revealed that Maria Santos had been struggling with student loan debt and living expenses while learning the watchmaking trade. Her apprentice salary was barely enough to cover her basic needs, and she had been working part-time jobs to make ends meet. She had been fascinated by the valuable watches that came through the workshop and had been researching their market values. Thompson discovered that Maria had been using her position as an apprentice to study the construction of the vintage watches during the restoration process. She had been making detailed notes and photographs of each timepiece, ostensibly for her training, but actually to help her create accurate replicas. Her technical drawings and documentation were so thorough that they could have served as blueprints for forgery. The breakthrough came when Thompson found Maria's hidden workshop in the basement of her apartment building. The space was equipped with specialized tools and materials for watchmaking, including vintage parts and movements that could be used to create convincing replicas. There were also detailed plans for each of the stolen watches, showing how she had analyzed and duplicated their mechanisms. The case deepened when Thompson learned that Maria had been collaborating with a network of watch collectors and dealers who specialized in rare timepieces. She had been providing them with detailed information about the watches that came through Giuseppe's workshop, allowing them to identify the most valuable pieces and plan their acquisition strategy. Thompson also discovered that Maria had been genuinely conflicted about her actions. She had initially planned to take just one watch to help with her financial problems, but the success of her first theft had led to increasingly ambitious schemes. She had been keeping detailed records of her activities, partly for security reasons, but also because she had been planning to eventually return the original watches. The investigation revealed that Maria had been accessing the workshop after hours using her legitimate key. She had been careful to work only when Giuseppe and Robert were away, and she had timed her thefts to coincide with periods when the customers were not expected to collect their watches immediately. She had even been maintaining the workshop's equipment and keeping detailed notes about her work to avoid suspicion. When confronted with the evidence, Maria confessed to the thefts and explained her complicated motivations. She had been genuinely passionate about watchmaking and had been devastated by the thought that her financial problems might force her to abandon her apprenticeship. She had convinced herself that she was borrowing the watches rather than stealing them, and she had been planning to eventually return them or pay for them. The case was resolved with a focus on education and rehabilitation rather than punishment. Giuseppe was disappointed by Maria's betrayal, but recognized her genuine talent and passion for watchmaking. He worked with law enforcement to arrange a plea deal that included restitution and community service, with the understanding that Maria would complete her apprenticeship under closer supervision. Several of the stolen watches were recovered from the collectors who had purchased them, and Maria's detailed documentation helped ensure that they were returned in good condition. The case led to improved security measures at the workshop and better screening procedures for apprentices, while also highlighting the pressures faced by young people trying to enter specialized trades. Giuseppe eventually allowed Maria to complete her apprenticeship, recognizing that her skills and knowledge made her too valuable to lose permanently. The experience taught both of them important lessons about trust, communication, and the importance of addressing financial problems before they lead to desperate actions. Story 3: The Archivist's Hidden History. Detective Sarah Winters was summoned to the City Historical Archive on a quiet Monday morning to investigate a discovery that had shaken the academic community. Dr. Margaret Whitmore, the head archivist, had found evidence that several historically significant documents had been systematically altered over the past decade, with the changes designed to support a particular interpretation of local history. The altered documents included city council minutes from the 1920s, property deeds from the early 1900s, and correspondence from prominent local families. The changes were subtle but significant. Dates had been modified, names had been altered, and entire paragraphs had been rewritten to support a narrative that portrayed certain families as more prominent and influential than they actually were. Winters began by examining the archive's security protocols and access records. The archive was housed in a converted mansion that had been donated to the city in the 1960s, and it contained thousands of documents related to local history. Access was restricted to researchers, historians, and genealogists who had been approved by the archive staff, and all visitors were required to sign in and work under supervision. The investigation revealed that the alterations had been made using sophisticated techniques that replicated the original ink and paper aging. The forger had used period-appropriate materials and had aged the documents artificially to make the changes appear authentic. This level of expertise suggested that the perpetrator had extensive knowledge of document preservation and historical research methods. Winters interviewed the archive's staff and regular users. Besides Dr. Whitmore, the archive employed two full-time researchers, Dr. Thomas Chen, a local historian who had been working there for 8 years, and Janet Mills, a genealogist who specialized in family history research. There were also several volunteer researchers who helped with cataloging and digitization projects. Dr. Chen was particularly interesting to Winters. He had written several books about local history and had been researching prominent families for a comprehensive study of the city's development. He had extensive access to the archive and possessed the technical knowledge necessary to create convincing document alterations. However, he seemed genuinely shocked by the discovery and had been helping Dr. Whitmore identify the extent of the alterations. The case took an unexpected direction when Winters discovered that the altered documents all related to the Morrison family, one of the city's oldest and most prominent dynasties. The changes had been designed to enhance the family's historical reputation, making them appear more influential in the city's development than they actually were. The alterations had been subtle but consistent, creating a false narrative that had been accepted by researchers for years. Winters learned that the Morrison family had been funding a major renovation of the historical archive, and they had also commissioned Dr. Chen to write a comprehensive history of their family's contributions to the city. The family had been concerned about their historical legacy and had been eager to ensure that their ancestors were properly recognized for their achievements. The investigation revealed that Dr. Chen had been under significant pressure to produce a favorable account of the Morrison family's history. His research had uncovered evidence that the family's early prominence had been exaggerated in previous historical accounts, and he had been struggling to reconcile the factual evidence with the family's expectations for their commissioned history. The breakthrough came when Winters found Dr. Chen's personal research files, which contained detailed notes about the discrepancies he had discovered in the Morrison family's historical record. The files showed that he had been systematically documenting the differences between the family's traditional narrative and the actual historical evidence, but he had been reluctant to challenge the accepted version of events. Winters discovered that Dr. Chen had been gradually altering the historical documents to support the Morrison family's preferred narrative. He had convinced himself that he was correcting historical inaccuracies rather than creating false evidence, and he had been careful to make changes that seemed plausible within the context of the time period. The case deepened when Winters learned that Dr. Chen had been facing financial difficulties related to his research projects. The Morrison family's commission had been his primary source of income, and he had been worried about losing their support if his research contradicted their family's traditional history. He had also been concerned about the impact on his academic reputation if he challenged well-established historical narratives. The investigation revealed that Dr. Chen had been using his legitimate access to the archive to make the alterations during regular working hours. He had been careful to work alone and had timed his activities to avoid detection by other staff members. He had also been maintaining detailed records of his changes, ostensibly for research purposes, but actually to keep track of his alterations. Winters also discovered that Dr. Chen had been genuinely conflicted about his actions. He had been keeping parallel research files, one showing the actual historical evidence and another showing the altered narrative. He had been planning to eventually publish the true history, but had been struggling with the ethical implications of his deception. When confronted with the evidence, Dr. Chen confessed to the document alterations and explained his complex motivations. He had been genuinely committed to historical accuracy, but had been caught between his professional obligations and his financial needs. He had convinced himself that he was making minor corrections rather than significant falsifications. The case was resolved with a focus on restoring historical accuracy and preventing similar incidents. Dr. Chen was dismissed from his position and faced criminal charges for document forgery, but he cooperated fully with efforts to identify and correct all of the alterations. The archive implemented new security measures and verification procedures to prevent future document tampering. The Morrison family's commissioned history was abandoned, and Dr. Chen's research files were used to create a more accurate account of the family's actual historical contributions. The case highlighted the pressures faced by historians and researchers who depend on private funding, while also emphasizing the importance of maintaining academic integrity even under financial pressure. The archive eventually recovered from the scandal and implemented new protocols for document authentication and researcher supervision. The incident served as a cautionary tale about the vulnerability of historical records and the importance of maintaining rigorous standards for document preservation and access. Story 4: The Piano Tuner's Perfect Pitch. Detective David Martinez was called to investigate an unusual case at the Metropolitan Opera House, where the resident piano tuner had discovered that someone had been subtly altering the tuning of instruments before important performances. The sabotage was so sophisticated that it had taken months to identify the pattern, and the perpetrator had demonstrated an extraordinary understanding of musical acoustics. The incidents had been affecting the opera company's performances in ways that were barely noticeable to most audience members, but were causing significant problems for the performers. Singers had been struggling with pitch accuracy, and the orchestra had been experiencing subtle intonation problems that were affecting the overall quality of the performances. Martinez began by interviewing Francesco Rossi, the master piano tuner who had discovered the sabotage. Rossi had been working at the Opera House for 20 years and had an exceptional ear for musical pitch. He explained that the alterations had been made with remarkable precision. Each instrument had been slightly detuned in a way that would cause problems during performance, but would not be immediately obvious during routine checks. The investigation revealed that the sabotage had been occurring for approximately 6 months, with incidents becoming more frequent as the opera company's season progressed. The perpetrator had been targeting specific instruments before important performances, creating problems that would be most damaging to the company's reputation. The timing suggested someone with intimate knowledge of the performance schedule. Martinez interviewed the Opera House staff and regular contractors. The facility employed a large number of musicians, stagehands, and administrative personnel, but only a few people had access to the instruments during the critical periods when the sabotage was occurring. The list of suspects included several orchestra members, instrument maintenance staff, and music directors. The case took an interesting direction when Martinez discovered that the opera company had been facing financial difficulties and had been forced to make budget cuts that had affected several staff positions. There had been tension between the administration and the musicians' union, and several longtime employees had been laid off or had their hours reduced. Martinez learned that Elena Rodriguez, a former orchestra member who had been let go 6 months earlier, had been struggling to find new employment and had been bitter about her dismissal. She had been a skilled violinist and had possessed extensive knowledge of musical acoustics and instrument maintenance. However, she had a solid alibi for most of the incidents, as she had been working as a private music teacher during the times when the sabotage was occurring. The breakthrough came when Martinez examined the pattern of the sabotage more carefully. The alterations had been made with mathematical precision, using acoustic principles that would create specific interference patterns during ensemble performances. This level of technical sophistication suggested someone with formal training in both music and acoustics. The investigation revealed that Dr. Patricia Vance, the Opera House's music director, had been under enormous pressure to improve the company's performance quality while working with reduced budgets and fewer staff members. She had been publicly criticized by music critics for recent performances and had been worried about the company's future funding. Martinez discovered that Dr. Vance had been creating the sabotage as a way to demonstrate the importance of proper instrument maintenance and adequate staffing. She had been hoping that the performance problems would convince the board of directors to restore the budget cuts and hire additional staff members. Her plan had been to gradually reveal the sabotage and position herself as the solution to the company's problems. The case deepened when Martinez learned that Dr. Vance had been using her legitimate access to the instruments to make the alterations. She had been working alone in the evenings and had been careful to avoid the security cameras. She had also been maintaining detailed records of her sabotage activities, ostensibly for research purposes, but actually to ensure that she could reverse the damage when necessary. Martinez also discovered that Dr. Vance had been genuinely concerned about the impact of her actions on the performers and the audience. She had been careful to create problems that would be noticeable to professionals but would not completely ruin the performances. She had also been planning to reveal the sabotage before any major recordings or televised performances. The investigation revealed that Dr. Vance had been using her extensive knowledge of acoustics and musical psychology to create very specific problems. She had been targeting instruments in ways that would cause the most frustration for the performers, while minimizing the risk of serious damage to the company's reputation. Her understanding of musical ensemble dynamics had allowed her to create problems that would cascade through the entire orchestra. When confronted with the evidence, Dr. Vance confessed to the sabotage and explained her complex motivations. She had been genuinely committed to the opera company's success, but had been frustrated by the board's unwillingness to adequately fund the organization. She had convinced herself that her actions were necessary to preserve the company's long-term viability. The case was resolved with Dr. Vance's resignation and a comprehensive review of the opera house's security and maintenance procedures. The board of directors used the incident as an opportunity to examine their budget decisions and ultimately restored some of the funding that had been cut. The case highlighted the pressures faced by the arts organizations in maintaining quality while dealing with financial constraints. The Opera House eventually recovered from the scandal and implemented new protocols for instrument maintenance and security. Dr. Vance's expertise in musical acoustics was not lost entirely. She was later hired as a consultant to help other musical organizations improve their performance quality, though under much closer supervision. Story 5, The Mapmaker's Territory. Detective Jennifer Kim was called to investigate a fascinating case at the City Planning Department, where a senior cartographer had discovered that someone had been systematically altering official city maps over the past year. The changes were subtle but significant. Property boundaries had been shifted, road layouts had been modified, and zoning designations had been changed in ways that would benefit certain development projects. The altered maps were not just decorative, they were official documents used for zoning decisions, building permits, and property assessments. The changes had been made with professional precision, using the same software and techniques employed by the city's mapping department. The forgeries were so convincing that they had been used in several important municipal decisions. Kim began by interviewing Helen Martinez, the chief cartographer who had discovered the alterations. Martinez had been working for the city for 15 years and had noticed the changes while conducting a routine audit of the mapping database. She explained that the alterations had been made to benefit specific development projects, particularly those involving high-value commercial properties. The investigation revealed that the map alterations had been coordinated with a series of zoning variance applications and development permits. The changes had been designed to make certain properties appear more suitable for development while creating obstacles for competing projects. The timing of the alterations suggested someone with inside knowledge of the planning process. Kim interviewed the planning department staff and discovered that the department had been under pressure to expedite certain development projects to boost the city's economic growth. There had been tension between the planning staff and the city council about the pace of development approvals, and several staff members had been working overtime to process applications. The case took an unexpected turn when Kim discovered that Robert Chen, a senior planner who had been with the department for 10 years, had been receiving regular payments from Riverside Development Corporation, one of the companies that had benefited from the altered maps. The payments had been disguised as consulting fees for work that Chen had been doing on evenings and weekends. Kim learned that Chen had been facing financial difficulties related to his divorce and child support obligations. He had been looking for ways to supplement his income and had been approached by Riverside Development to provide consulting services. The arrangement had gradually evolved from legitimate consulting to more questionable activities. The investigation revealed that Chen had been using his legitimate access to the mapping system to make the alterations. He had been careful to work during off hours and had been using his administrative privileges to modify the database without leaving obvious traces. He had also been coordinating with Riverside Development to ensure that the changes would benefit their specific projects. Kim discovered that Chen had been creating false documentation to support the altered maps, including fake survey reports and property assessments. He had been using his knowledge of the planning process to create convincing forgeries that would pass routine inspections. His work had been so thorough that several development projects had been approved based on the false information. The case deepened when Kim learned that Chen had been genuinely conflicted about his actions. He had initially believed that he was simply helping to streamline the development process, but he had gradually realized that his activities were causing real harm to property owners and competing developers. He had been keeping detailed records of his alterations, partly for security reasons, but also because he had been planning to eventually expose the corruption. The investigation revealed that Chen had been working with a network of developers and city officials who were involved in the scheme. The altered maps had been part of a broader pattern of corruption that had affected multiple development projects and had cost the city millions of dollars in lost revenue and legal settlements. Kim also discovered that Chen had been trying to withdraw from the scheme in recent months. He had been concerned about the increasing scope of the corruption and had been worried about the legal consequences of his actions. He had been documenting his activities and had been considering approaching law enforcement with information about the broader corruption network. When confronted with the evidence, Chen confessed to the map alterations and provided detailed information about the corruption scheme. He explained that he had been initially motivated by financial need but had become increasingly uncomfortable with the ethical implications of his actions. He had been trapped by his financial obligations and his fear of the consequences of exposing the corruption. The case led to a major investigation of corruption in the city's planning department and resulted in criminal charges against several officials and developers. Chen's cooperation with the investigation helped expose the full scope of the scheme and led to significant reforms in the city's development approval process. The planning department implemented new security measures and oversight procedures to prevent similar corruption in the future. Chen faced criminal charges, but received a reduced sentence in exchange for his cooperation with the investigation. The case highlighted the vulnerability of municipal systems to corruption and the importance of maintaining ethical standards in public service. The city eventually recovered from the scandal and implemented new transparency measures for development approvals. The altered maps were corrected, and several development projects were reviewed to ensure that they had been approved based on accurate information. The case served as a reminder of the importance of integrity in public administration and the need for robust oversight of municipal decision-making processes. Story 6. The Vanishing Violinist. Detective Sarah Chen had seen many missing person cases, but the disappearance of renowned violinist Marcus Holloway felt different from the start. Marcus had been scheduled to perform at Carnegie Hall on a Tuesday evening, but never showed up. His apartment was found exactly as he'd left it that morning, coffee still warm, sheet music spread across his piano, and his prized Stradivarius sitting in its case. The first clue came from Marcus's neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who mentioned seeing a delivery truck parked outside the building that afternoon. No deliveries were scheduled. Security footage revealed a man in coveralls carrying what appeared to be a large instrument case to the truck. The license plate was obscured by mud. Chen's investigation led her to Marcus's ex-business partner, David Fleming, who had been involved in a bitter lawsuit over concert bookings. Fleming had an alibi, but something felt off about his nervous demeanor and the way he kept checking his phone during questioning. The breakthrough came when Chen discovered that Marcus had been investigating the authenticity of several valuable instruments being sold through Fleming's auction house. Hidden in Marcus's apartment, behind a false panel in his desk, were documents suggesting that Fleming had been selling forgeries to wealthy collectors for years. Following a paper trail of insurance claims and shipping records, Chen tracked the delivery truck to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city. Inside, she found not only Marcus, alive but held captive, but also a sophisticated forgery operation. Fleming had orchestrated the kidnapping to prevent Marcus from exposing his crimes, planning to stage the violinist's death after the heat died down. Marcus was reunited with his Stradivarius, Fleming was arrested, and the case closed with the recovery of over $2 million in stolen and forged instruments. Story 7. The Midnight Arsonist. For 3 months, fires had been appearing across the quiet suburb of Millbrook, always striking between midnight and 2 a.m. Detective James Morrison had been tracking what seemed like a methodical pattern. Each fire was set in a different neighborhood, each targeted empty buildings, and each was started using the same accelerant technique. The arsonist was careful, never leaving obvious evidence and always striking when the buildings were unoccupied. No one had been hurt, but the community was on edge. Morrison noticed that each fire occurred exactly 12 days apart, always on buildings that had been recently sold or were in the process of being demolished. The investigation took a turn when Morrison discovered that all the targeted buildings had been purchased by the same development company, Millbrook Properties, owned by local businessman Robert Nash. Nash seemed genuinely shocked by the connection and provided full cooperation, including access to all his company records. Morrison spent hours reviewing property records, insurance claims, and city planning documents. He noticed that Nash's company had been struggling financially, with several projects stalled due to city council opposition. The fires, while not directly benefiting Nash, were destroying buildings that had been blocking his development plans. The detective's suspicion shifted when he discovered that Nash's assistant, Linda Porter, had access to all the property information and had been working late many nights around the time of the fires. Porter lived alone, drove a car that matched witness descriptions of a vehicle seen near 2 fire sites, and had recently purchased camping equipment that included materials that could be used for arson. Surveillance revealed Porter's nighttime activities. She had been setting the fires not for insurance money, but out of a twisted sense of loyalty to Nash, believing she was helping clear obstacles to his business success. When confronted with evidence including accelerant residue found in her garage, Porter confessed to all 7 fires. Nash was cleared of all charges, Porter was arrested, and the midnight fire stopped. The case highlighted how personal obsession can drive someone to commit crimes they believe are justified. Story 8, The Missing Manuscript. Professor Eleanor Whitman was found dead in her locked university office on a Sunday morning, an apparent heart attack according to the initial medical examination. However, Detective Lisa Park noticed something unusual. Whitman's desk had been carefully searched, with papers neatly restacked and drawers slightly askew. More importantly, colleagues mentioned that Whitman had been working on a valuable manuscript that was nowhere to be found. The manuscript in question was a previously unknown work by a famous 19th century author, potentially worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Whitman had been preparing to authenticate it for a private collector when she died. The collector, Harrison Webb, claimed he had never received the manuscript and was as puzzled as anyone by its disappearance. Park's investigation revealed that 3 people had keys to Whitman's office: the department head, Dr. Richard Stone, the graduate student assistant, Tom Bradley, and the night custodian, Frank Morrison. Each had alibis for the weekend when Whitman died, but Park sensed there was more to the story. The breakthrough came when Park discovered that the manuscript had been digitally photographed by Whitman days before her death. The images were stored on a cloud server, and they revealed something crucial. The manuscript contained a hidden inscription that dramatically increased its value. Only someone with expertise in the period would have recognized its significance. Further investigation revealed that Dr. Stone had been facing financial difficulties due to a messy divorce and had been secretly working as a consultant for rare book dealers. He had knowledge of Whitman's work and access to her office. More damning, Park found that Stone had recently made a large deposit to his bank account, claiming it was from consulting work. When confronted, Stone admitted to taking the manuscript after finding Whitman's body, but insisted he hadn't caused her death. The medical examiner's second, more thorough examination revealed that Whitman had indeed died naturally, but Stone had discovered her body hours before calling for help, giving him time to search for and steal the manuscript. Stone was arrested for theft and tampering with evidence. The manuscript was recovered from a safety deposit box and returned to the collector, while Stone faced both criminal charges and the end of his academic career. Story 9, The Phantom Photographer. A series of break-ins had been plaguing the upscale Riverside Heights neighborhood, but these weren't typical burglaries. Nothing was being stolen. Instead, the intruder was rearranging furniture, taking photographs, and leaving behind small, cryptic notes. Detective Maria Santos had never encountered anything like it. The notes were always the same: memories preserved, truth revealed. The photographs, left behind in neat stacks, showed the interior of each home from various angles, but certain items were circled in red ink: family photos, personal documents, and seemingly random objects. The break-ins occurred when residents were away, and the intruder was careful to leave no fingerprints or DNA evidence. Santos initially thought she was dealing with someone mentally unstable, but the methodical nature of the crimes suggested otherwise. Each targeted home belonged to families who had lived in the neighborhood for over 20 years, and all had children who were now adults. The connection wasn't immediately obvious. The case took a dramatic turn when Santos discovered that all the targeted families had been involved in a tragic incident 25 years earlier. A young girl named Emma Chen had disappeared from the neighborhood playground, and despite extensive searches, she was never found. The case had divided the community, with some residents suspecting others of involvement. Through old police files, Santos learned that Emma's older brother, Michael Chen, had been institutionalized after a breakdown following his sister's disappearance. He had been recently released and was living in a halfway house across town. The photographs and notes were his way of investigating what he believed was a conspiracy among the neighborhood families to cover up what really happened to Emma. Santos tracked Michael to an abandoned house where he had set up an elaborate investigation board with photos, documents, and timelines. He wasn't dangerous, but his obsession with solving his sister's disappearance had driven him to break into the homes of people he suspected of hiding the truth. The investigation ultimately revealed that Emma had indeed been killed in an accident involving several neighborhood children, and their parents had covered it up to protect them. Michael's unconventional detective work had actually uncovered evidence that led to the resolution of his sister's case, though his methods were illegal. Michael was sentenced to community service and counseling, while several adults faced charges for the decades-old cover-up. Emma's remains were finally found and given a proper burial, bringing closure to a mystery that had haunted the neighborhood for 25 years. Story 10: The Clockmaker's Secret. Detective Thomas Brennan had been called to investigate what appeared to be a simple burglary at Meridian Antique Clocks, a small shop nestled in the historic district of downtown. The owner, 73-year-old Heinrich Zimmerman, had discovered his shop ransacked when he arrived that Tuesday morning. However, as Brennan surveyed the scene, he noticed something peculiar. Despite the apparent chaos, none of the valuable antique clocks had been stolen. Zimmerman, a soft-spoken man with thick German accent, explained that he had inherited the shop from his father 40 years ago. The family had been clockmakers for generations, specializing in repairing and restoring timepieces from the 18th and 19th centuries. What puzzled both men was that the intruder had seemed to focus entirely on the workshop area behind the main shop, where Zimmerman kept his tools and work-in-progress pieces. The initial investigation revealed that the back door had been jimmied open sometime between midnight and 6 a.m. The intruder had methodically searched through drawers, cabinets, and workbenches, but had left behind thousands of dollars worth of antique clocks, rare tools, and even cash from the register. Zimmerman insisted nothing was missing, but his nervous demeanor suggested he wasn't telling the complete truth. Brennan's first lead came from the shop's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Adelaide Foster, who lived in the apartment above the bakery next door. She had been awakened around 2 a.m. by what she described as methodical tapping sounds coming from the clock shop. When she looked out her window, she saw a figure with a flashlight moving around inside the workshop, but couldn't make out any details about the person. The detective decided to delve deeper into Zimmerman's background. What he discovered was a complex family history that stretched back to World War II. Heinrich's father, Klaus Zimmerman, had fled Germany in 1947 and established the clock shop shortly after arriving in America. According to immigration records, Klaus had been a skilled craftsman who had worked for wealthy families in Munich before the war. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Brennan then received a call from Dr. Rebecca Hayes, a history professor at the local university. She had been researching Nazi art theft for a book she was writing and had come across some interesting information about the Zimmerman family. According to wartime records she had uncovered, Klaus Zimmerman had been employed by the Bavarian State Collection, where he had been responsible for maintaining the mechanical components of elaborate astronomical clocks and music boxes that had been confiscated from Jewish families. Dr. Hayes explained that many of these items had never been returned to their rightful owners after the war, and that some had likely been smuggled out of Germany by fleeing Nazis and their collaborators. She suggested that Klaus Zimmermann might have brought more than just his skills to America. He might have brought stolen treasures as well. Armed with this new information, Brennan returned to question Heinrich more aggressively. The old clockmaker's composure finally cracked when presented with the wartime documents. Through tears, he admitted that his father had indeed brought several valuable pieces to America, hidden within the mechanisms of seemingly ordinary clocks. Heinrich had discovered them years ago while repairing some of his father's personal collection. The pieces included a gold and silver astronomical clock that had belonged to a prominent Jewish banker in Munich, a collection of rare pocket watches, and several ornate music boxes. Heinrich had kept them hidden all these years, too afraid to come forward but unable to bring himself to profit from them. He had been secretly researching their original owners, hoping to find a way to return them anonymously. The breakthrough in the case came when Brennan traced the break-in to Marcus Weber, a private investigator who had been hired by the grandson of one of the original owners. Weber had spent years tracking down stolen artifacts and had recently discovered evidence pointing to the Zimmermann shop. Rather than going through legal channels, he had decided to search for the items himself. Weber's investigation had led him to believe that the stolen pieces were hidden within the mechanisms of clocks in Zimmermann's workshop. He had been systematically searching through the timepieces, looking for hidden compartments or unusual modifications that might conceal the artifacts. His search had been thorough but ultimately unsuccessful. The items were actually hidden in a secret compartment in the shop's basement that Heinrich's father had constructed decades earlier. The resolution of the case was both complex and emotionally charged. Heinrich voluntarily surrendered the stolen items, which were authenticated and returned to the families of their original owners. Weber was charged with breaking and entering, but received a suspended sentence due to the circumstances. Heinrich faced no criminal charges, as the statute of limitations had long since expired and he had not been the one who originally stole the items. The case highlighted the lasting impact of wartime crimes and the difficult moral questions faced by the children of those who had participated in them. Heinrich continued to operate his shop, but donated the proceeds from several valuable clock sales to organizations that helped Holocaust survivors. The investigation had finally allowed him to lift a burden he had carried for decades, even though it meant facing the uncomfortable truth about his father's past. Dr. Hayes used the case as a chapter in her book about the ongoing efforts to return stolen artwork and artifacts to their rightful owners. The story served as a reminder that the effects of historical crimes could surface decades later, affecting people who had no direct involvement in the original acts, but who inherited their consequences. Story 11, The Midnight Gardener. Detective Angela Rodriguez had seen many unusual cases during her 15 years on the force, but the mystery of the Midnight Gardener was unlike anything she had encountered before. Over the past 2 months, residents of the quiet Maplewood subdivision had been waking up to find their yards mysteriously improved overnight, dead plants replaced with thriving ones, gardens expertly weeded and watered, and elaborate flower arrangements left on doorsteps. At first, homeowners had been delighted by the anonymous acts of kindness. The work was professional quality, with an obvious expert's touch in plant selection and landscape design. However, as the incidents continued, some residents began to feel uneasy. The mysterious gardener seemed to know intimate details about their properties, which plants would thrive in specific microclimates, which areas had drainage problems, and even which flowers matched the existing color schemes of their homes. The case officially became a police matter when several residents reported that the gardener had been entering their backyards despite locked gates and privacy fences. While no property had been damaged and nothing had been stolen, the technical charges of trespassing and breaking and entering needed to be investigated. Rodriguez was assigned to the case, initially expecting it to be a simple matter of identifying and warning an overzealous neighbor. Her first step was to map out the affected properties. She discovered that the Midnight Gardener had visited 43 homes over 8 weeks, always working between 11 p.m. and 4 a.m., and never hitting the same house twice. The pattern seemed random at first, but Rodriguez noticed that the homes formed a rough spiral pattern radiating out from the center of the subdivision. The detective's investigation revealed that the gardening work was remarkably sophisticated. She consulted with Maria Santos, a local landscape architect, who examined several of the midnight improvements. Santos was amazed by the quality of the work. Whoever was doing this had extensive knowledge of horticulture, soil composition, and seasonal plant care. The plant selections were perfect for the local climate and soil conditions, and the installation techniques were professional grade. Rodriguez's first breakthrough came from the security system of Jonathan and Amy Chen, whose backyard had been visited 3 weeks earlier. Their motion-activated cameras had captured grainy footage of a figure in dark clothing working methodically in their garden. The person appeared to be of medium height and build, moved with purpose and expertise, and had brought professional-grade tools and supplies. The investigation took an interesting turn when Rodriguez discovered that all of the affected homes had been built by the same construction company, Maplewood Developers, between 2018 and 2020. The original landscaping for the entire subdivision had been done by Green Thumb Landscaping, a company that had gone out of business 18 months earlier when its owner, David Park, had suffered a serious car accident that left him unable to work. Rodriguez tracked down David Park to a rehabilitation facility across town. The 45-year-old landscaper had been making remarkable progress in his recovery from traumatic brain injury and partial paralysis, but he was still unable to work full-time. When she first interviewed him, Park seemed genuinely confused about the midnight gardening incidents and had a solid alibi. He lived in a care facility with strict sign-in and sign-out procedures. However, Rodriguez's instincts told her that Park knew more than he was letting on. She decided to investigate his background more thoroughly. What she discovered was a man who had been passionate about his work to an almost obsessive degree. For his accident, Park had been known for his perfectionism and his inability to leave a job unfinished. Former clients described him as someone who would return to properties months after completion to make small adjustments and improvements. The breakthrough came when Rodriguez discovered that Park had been secretly leaving the facility several nights a week. He had figured out how to disable the motion sensors in his room and had been climbing out through a first-floor window. His physical therapy had progressed much further than anyone realized, and he had been using his increased mobility to return to his work. Park's motivation, as Rodriguez eventually learned, was deeply personal. The car accident had not only ended his career, but had also been caused by his own drunk driving. He had been struggling with alcoholism and depression, and the accident had occurred while he was driving home from a bar. The guilt from the accident, combined with his identity being so closely tied to his work, had driven him to secretly return to landscaping as a form of therapy and penance. The midnight gardening was Park's way of reconnecting with his purpose and making amends for the mistakes that had led to his accident. He had been using his intimate knowledge of the subdivision's properties, knowledge he had gained during the original landscaping project, to systematically improve and maintain the gardens he felt responsible for. He had been funding the project with his disability payments and had been growing many of the plants himself in a small greenhouse he had set up behind the rehabilitation facility. The case reached its resolution when Rodriguez arranged a meeting between Park and several of the homeowners whose properties he had improved. Rather than pressing charges, the residents were moved by Park's story and his dedication to making amends. Several of them offered to hire him for legitimate landscaping work as he continued his recovery. The rehabilitation facility worked with Park to channel his therapeutic gardening into a structured program. He was allowed to continue working on landscaping projects, but with proper supervision and documentation. His midnight wanderings stopped, replaced by scheduled day work that helped both his physical and emotional recovery. Rodriguez's investigation had revealed that sometimes what appears to be criminal behavior is actually someone's attempt to heal and make amends. The case became a reminder that understanding the motivation behind unusual crimes can sometimes lead to solutions that benefit everyone involved. Park eventually started a small landscaping business specializing in therapeutic gardens for medical facilities, turning his personal recovery into a way to help others. The Maplewood subdivision became known for having some of the most beautiful gardens in the city, a lasting testament to one man's determination to make things right. The case was closed without any charges being filed, and Park's story became an inspiration for others dealing with similar struggles with identity and purpose after life-changing accidents. Story 12. The Vanishing Violinist Returns. Detective Rachel Kim thought she had seen the last of musical mysteries when she solved the case of the missing concert pianist 2 years earlier. However, the call that came in on a rainy Thursday morning would prove that the world of classical music held more secrets than she had ever imagined. The body of renowned violin maker Antonio Rossi had been found in his workshop, and the circumstances surrounding his death were as mysterious as they were tragic. Rossi had been discovered by his apprentice, Maria Gonzalez, when she arrived for work that morning. The 78-year-old craftsman was found slumped over his workbench, apparently having died of a heart attack while working late the previous night. However, what made the scene unusual was the state of his workshop. It had been meticulously cleaned and organized, with tools arranged in perfect order and no trace of the project he had been working on for the past 6 months. According to Maria, Rossi had been crafting a replica of a famous Guarneri violin that had been lost during World War II. The original instrument, known as il canone, the cannon, for its powerful sound, had belonged to the legendary violinist Niccolo Paganini and had been stolen from a private collection in Milan in 1943. Rossi had been commissioned by an anonymous collector to create an exact replica, working from detailed photographs and measurements that had been preserved in the archives of the original maker's workshop. Kim's investigation began routinely, but several details bothered her. First, the medical examiner noted that while Rossi had indeed died of a heart attack, the position of his body suggested he had been moved after death. Second, the workshop's security system had been disabled sometime between 8 p.m. and midnight, but there were no signs of forced entry. Most puzzling of all, the nearly completed violin replica had vanished completely, along with all of Rossi's notes and reference materials. The detective's first lead came from Dr. James Morrison, a musicologist at the university who had been consulting with Rossi on the historical aspects of the replica project. Morrison explained that the original Guarneri had been more than just a valuable instrument. It had been a symbol of Italian cultural heritage and had been actively sought by collectors and museums for decades. The replica project had been shrouded in secrecy, with Rossi refusing to reveal the identity of his client. Kim's investigation revealed that Rossi had been in contact with several suspicious individuals in the weeks before his death. Phone records showed calls from international numbers, including several from Switzerland and one from a private investigator in New York. Bank records indicated that Rossi had received a substantial payment, $50,000, 2 months earlier, but the source of the funds was traced to a shell company that proved impossible to identify. The case took a dramatic turn when Kim received a visit from Inspector Claude Dubois of Interpol. Dubois explained that the theft of the original Guarneri violin had been connected to a much larger network of Nazi art and artifact theft during World War II. The violin had been stolen from the Benedetti family, prominent Jewish musicians who had been deported to concentration camps. The instrument had surfaced briefly in the 1960s before disappearing again, and there had been rumors of its existence in private collections ever since. Dubois revealed that several law enforcement agencies had been tracking the movements of stolen cultural artifacts, and Rossi's replica project had raised red flags because it suggested that someone might be trying to authenticate or sell the original instrument. The creation of an expert replica could serve several purposes in art fraud. It could be used to replace the original in a collection, allowing the real piece to be sold secretly, or it could be used to test authentication methods before attempting to sell the original. The investigation intensified when Kim discovered that Rossi had been visited by 3 different individuals in the week before his death. Security footage from neighboring businesses showed a woman in her 50s, a man in his 30s, and an elderly gentleman who had each spent time in Rossi's workshop. None of them had been identified, and all had been careful to avoid showing their faces clearly to cameras. Kim's breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Maria Gonzalez, Rossi's apprentice, finally admitted that she had been holding back information. On the night of Rossi's death, she had returned to the workshop to retrieve some personal tools she had forgotten. She had found her mentor alive, but deeply distressed, arguing with someone on the phone in rapid Italian. She had heard him mention the real one, and they know it exists, before noticing her presence and ending the call. Further investigation revealed that Rossi had been playing a dangerous game. He had indeed been commissioned to create a replica, but he had also been secretly investigating the provenance of the original instrument. His research had led him to believe that the person who had commissioned the replica was actually in possession of the stolen original and was planning to use the replica to legitimize its sale. The case reached its climax when Kim, working with Interpol, traced the mysterious client to Hermann Weber, a reclusive collector living in Geneva. Weber had inherited a collection of questionable provenance from his father, a former Nazi officer who had been involved in the systematic theft of Jewish-owned art and artifacts during the war. Weber had been trying to quietly sell pieces from the collection for years, but had been stymied by increased scrutiny from law enforcement and museums. The investigation revealed that Weber had commissioned the replica not to defraud buyers, but to replace the original in his collection before donating it to a museum. His plan had been to keep the original while publicly appearing to return stolen artifacts to their rightful owners. However, Rossi had figured out the scheme and had been threatening to expose Weber unless he agreed to return the original to the Benedetti family descendants. The confrontation had led to Weber traveling to confront Rossi personally. While Weber maintained that he had only intended to convince the violin maker to complete the replica and stay quiet, the stress of the encounter had triggered Rossi's fatal heart attack. Panicking, Weber had cleaned the workshop and taken the replica and all documentation, hoping to cover up his connection to the incident. The resolution of the case was complex and international in scope. Weber was arrested in Geneva and eventually extradited to face charges related to Rossi's death and the possession of stolen cultural artifacts. The original Guarneri violin was recovered from Weber's collection and, after extensive authentication, was returned to the descendants of the Benedetti family. The case highlighted the ongoing impact of World War II cultural theft and the complex moral and legal issues surrounding the return of stolen artifacts. It also demonstrated how the creation of replicas and forgeries could be used not just to defraud buyers, but to complicate the process of returning stolen items to their rightful owners. Kim's investigation had uncovered not just a crime, but a piece of history that had been hidden for decades. The case became a model for international cooperation in recovering stolen cultural artifacts and brought attention to the ongoing efforts to return Nazi-looted art to its rightful owners. Rossi's death, while tragic, had ultimately resulted in the return of a priceless piece of musical history to the family that had lost it during one of the darkest periods in human history. The violin was eventually donated to a museum where it could be played by visiting musicians and appreciated by the public, ensuring that its beautiful sound would continue to honor the memory of those who had been lost during the war. The case served as a reminder that some investigations extend far beyond individual crimes to touch on broader questions of justice, memory, and the preservation of cultural heritage. If you've made it this far, your eyes may be heavy, your mind winding down, your thoughts drifting like fog across the Pacific. These cases linger, not in action, but in atmosphere, in mystery, in suggestion. Sleep now, with the hum of the noir city behind you and the soft steps of the last detective fading into quiet. Tomorrow brings more questions, but for tonight, let the mystery rest beside you.